I remember the day like it was a punch to the chest. I was sipping my morning coffee, staring out the kitchen window at the perfectly manicured lawn, when the HOA letter slid through the mailbox. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe some bored neighbor with too much time on their hands. But no, this was official. My eyes widened as I read the first line. Effective immediately, all firearms are prohibited within the residence and property of this HOA. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and read it again. My hands started shaking. They were serious. Me, my home, my guns, gone just like that. I sank into the kitchen chair, trying to process the absurdity. A surge of disbelief coursed through me. This was America, right? The land of the free. Somehow, my perfect little neighborhood had turned into a cage with white picket bars, where the HOA dictated not only how I trimmed my hedges, but now even what I could legally own in my own home. I laughed nervously at first, because what else could I do? They probably think my collection of rifles is scarier than the state troopers who patrol the next town over, I muttered to myself. But the laughter quickly faded. Deep down, I knew I couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just about me or my guns, it was about standing up for what was right, for every neighbor who might be next. I grabbed the letter and started packing. My mind raced through every possible reaction. Comply? That was out of the question. My pulse quickened with anger and adrenaline. I could almost hear the HOA board's smug laughter echoing in my head. Let's see him try to fight us. Well, I was about to show them exactly what I was capable of. I started digging into the HOA rules, reading every clause, every fine print, every weird restriction that had somehow become law in our little bubble. No fireworks on July 4th. No Christmas lights past February. No paint outside the approved color palette. And now this, a ban on firearms. I shook my head in disbelief. It felt like living in some dystopian sitcom where the punchline was my life being micromanaged to absurdity. The tension in the air in my house was suffocating. I could feel the weight of the fight ahead pressing down on me. I imagined walking into the HOA office, papers in hand, ready to argue, ready to fight. But then reality hit me. I had to plan. One wrong move and they could slap fines, take me to court, or worse, make me the laughingstock of the neighborhood. I spent the rest of the day packing and researching, tapping into every ounce of stubbornness I had. I reached out to a friend who was a lawyer just to get a sense of how deep the rabbit hole went. She didn't sugarcoat it. They think they're untouchable, but HOA rules can't override state and federal law. You just have to be smart. Her words were both comforting and terrifying. Smart. Yes, I needed a plan, and it had to be flawless. As evening fell, I stood on my porch, looking at my quiet street. Neighbors waved, unaware of the storm brewing behind my calm facade. To them, it was just another perfect day. To me, it was the beginning of a war I hadn't expected to fight in my own backyard. And the worst part, I knew the HOA thought they had won already. That smug satisfaction in their letters, the way they structured every word to sound official and terrifying, they believed they had me cornered. But they didn't know me. They didn't know how far I was willing to go to defend my rights, my property, and my peace of mind. I clenched my fists, heart hammering in my chest. Tomorrow, I'd start gathering evidence. I'd read every law, every precedent, every loophole they didn't see coming, because this wasn't just about guns. This was about freedom. And one thing the HOA had underestimated was my determination. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my lawn, I whispered to myself, they may have sent the letter, but the fight starts now, and they're about to regret ever trying to take my rights away. The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of anger and adrenaline. I knew I couldn't just react, I had to think. The HOA wasn't just some group of neighbors with a newsletter. They were organized, precise, and dangerously bureaucratic. And I had to learn their playbook before making a move. I pulled out every document I had. The HOA bylaws, the original homeowner agreement, even the letters from previous years about lawn rules and mailbox decorations. As I read, I realized something chilling. These people were meticulous. Every word was calculated, every clause intentionally vague, designed to intimidate. And right there, in black and white, was the rule they used to justify banning firearms. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just a random overreach, they had thought this through. No firearms on property, it read, to ensure the safety and comfort of all residents. Safety and comfort. Those two words dripped with condescension. It was almost insulting. As if my life, my right to protect my family, didn't count. I spent hours combing through past meeting minutes, emails, and notices. The HOA's obsession with control was astonishing. One meeting had focused entirely on the shade of flowers in front yards. Another debated whether a mailbox post could be 1.5 inches taller than regulation. And now, guns. My blood boiled. They weren't protecting anyone, they were asserting power, and I had become their latest target. By the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, I had a growing sense of clarity. These people weren't just bullies, they were methodical, organized, and utterly convinced of their authority. And if I wanted to fight back, I couldn't just storm into their next meeting screaming. I had to understand them, predict them, and outmaneuver them. But the deeper I dug, the more absurd it became. Other homeowners had quietly defied smaller rules, a Christmas wreath past February, a slightly off-color mailbox. Yet here I was, facing the full brunt of their fury because my collection of firearms apparently threatened comfort. I couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. The irony was delicious. My rifles were safer than the kid on the electric scooter who zipped down the street every morning without a helmet. I realized I wasn't just gathering facts, I was plotting a path. Every misstep by the HOA, every tiny overreach, was a crack I could exploit. But I also knew one mistake could ruin everything. I had to be precise, careful, and strategic. This wasn't a shouting match at a backyard barbecue, it was chess, and I had to anticipate every move. As night fell, I sat in my living room, surrounded by papers, laptop screens, and legal references. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors, some whispering support, others fearful of getting involved. I appreciated their caution but knew I had to take the lead. If I hesitated, if I faltered, the HOA would see weakness and crush me. Then came the thought that chilled me even more. What if they tried to enforce the ban immediately? What if tomorrow, someone from the HOA actually came to my door, demanding I hand over firearms or face penalties? My heart raced just imagining the confrontation. I couldn't let that happen. I needed a plan, one that made it clear I wasn't afraid, one that would make them question every step they had taken against me. I made a list. First, gather all legal references confirming the Second Amendment rights and state laws protecting gun ownership. Second, collect proof of HOA overreach from past meetings, emails, and notices. Third, quietly reach out to neighbors who might be willing to support me without exposing themselves to retaliation. And then I paused. I realized this fight wasn't just about me anymore. It was about principle, about standing up to an organization that thought it could dictate rights inside a private home, about showing that even in a quiet neighborhood, the Second Amendment wasn't negotiable. As I sat back, staring at the stack of papers in front of me, I whispered to myself, "They think they're untouchable. They think I'll fold, but they haven't seen anything yet." And in that moment, I knew that the calm, orderly streets of my neighborhood were about to be shaken in ways the HOA would never anticipate. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The night after my deep dive into the HOA's rules, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined their smug little board, convinced they'd won before the fight even started. That smugness fueled me more than anger ever could. I knew one thing. I wasn't just defending my guns, I was defending my home, my rights, and my sanity. First, I had to understand every weapon in my arsenal, and not the kind locked in my safe. I pulled out my laptop, legal textbooks, and even old case notes from friends in law enforcement. I was piecing together a map of loopholes, precedents, and strategies that would make even the HOA's most meticulous lawyer pause. The deeper I got, the more absurdly confident I became. They had written rules, but laws were higher. Federal and state regulations didn't care about HOA feelings. Every document I printed, highlighted, and cross-referenced became a tiny arrow in my quiver, ready to strike at the heart of their overreach. But it wasn't just about legal firepower. I needed allies quietly without exposing them to retaliation. I started making subtle calls, gauging which neighbors were frustrated with the HOA's micromanaging tendencies. One by one, they started revealing small cracks, unreported fines, confusing clauses, little injustices that the board thought no one noticed. I jotted down every detail. Each story was another piece of evidence, another thread I could pull to unravel their control. At the same time, I had to be careful. The HOA loved surveillance and control, and I didn't want them sniffing out my strategy before I was ready. I began working late at night, my home office lit only by a single desk lamp. Every email I drafted, every note I wrote, every legal reference I printed was done in secret. One slip, and the HOA could try to intimidate me further, or worse, claim I was violating some obscure rule. Even planning this counterattack became a game of nerves. I imagined what would happen if they caught wind of my moves. Karen, our self-proclaimed HOA Queen of Order, would probably hold an emergency meeting, gavel in hand, with the entire board nodding at every word she spoke. I could almost hear her voice. "He's out of line, we must enforce the rules immediately." But I wasn't afraid. Fear had no place in this fight. The tension was constant. Every time the doorbell rang, my pulse spiked. Every neighbor passing by seemed suspicious, like they might report me for some imaginary infraction. Even my dog, normally lazy and oblivious, seemed tense, as if he could sense the brewing storm. The entire neighborhood had become a chessboard, and every move mattered. By midweek, I had a plan forming in my mind. Step 1. Compile every violation of law or precedent that contradicted the HOA's firearm ban. Step 2. Document every absurd overreach they had attempted in the past. Step 3. Create a quiet but undeniable alliance of neighbors who were willing to back me up if the board tried to escalate. Step 4. Prepare for the ultimate confrontation, a meeting or legal challenge where I would present my evidence and show them they weren't untouchable. I started drafting my arguments, not just for legality but for psychology. I knew the HOA thrived on intimidation. If I appeared unshakable, organized, and confident, I could disrupt their control before the first word of their meeting even started. Every line I wrote, every document I highlighted, became a weapon in its own right. As I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about a gun ban anymore. This was a battle over authority, over freedom, over principle. And if I faltered, the HOA would not stop at me. They would tighten the screws on the next homeowner, the next family, until everyone in the neighborhood lived under silent fear of their rules. My jaw tightened. I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't going to be the cautionary tale whispered about in HOA meetings. I would be the one who exposed the cracks in their perfect little empire, who reminded them that even the most organized bureaucracy couldn't crush the spirit of someone willing to fight for what was right. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was ready. The plan was set. The evidence was compiled. And most importantly, my resolve was unshakable. Tomorrow, I would begin the first moves in a battle they didn't even realize had started. I stared out the window at the quiet street, the moonlight reflecting off the neatly trimmed lawns, and whispered to myself, "They think this is a game they can win. But every empire has a weak spot, and I just found theirs." The day of the HOA meeting arrived faster than I expected, and I couldn't shake the mix of nerves and determination. My stomach was in knots as I drove down the quiet, tree-lined streets of our neighborhood. Every perfectly trimmed hedge, every white picket fence, felt like a reminder that I was about to disrupt their meticulously controlled world. I parked my car near the community hall and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a battlefield. The board had no idea what I had prepared, and I intended to make them regret ever thinking they could bully me. I took a deep breath, rehearsing my arguments silently. Logic, law, principle, every point had to hit hard. There would be no room for hesitation. When I entered the hall, it was like stepping into an arena. The board members sat at their long table, papers stacked neatly in front of them, expressions frozen in that smug superiority they always wore. Karen, of course, was there, eyes narrowing as she spotted me. She had that look, the one that said she thought I'd fold under the weight of their authority. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone dripping with fake civility, "we're here to discuss your recent actions regarding HOA regulations." I smiled inwardly. They had no idea. "I assume you mean the letter banning firearms," I replied calmly. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Silence. Tension so thick I could almost feel it pressing on my chest. Karen leaned forward, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail on the table. "Yes, we believe that for the comfort and safety of all residents, this is necessary. Your compliance is expected." I leaned back, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then I began. I laid out every point, every legal reference, every precedent that contradicted their claim. Each word was measured, each sentence building momentum. I could see their expressions shift subtly, smugness fading, replaced with unease. "You see," I said, voice calm but firm, "your rules may control the color of my mailbox or the timing of my holiday lights, but they do not override state or federal law. The Second Amendment isn't just a suggestion, and your overreach could have serious legal consequences." Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's jaw tightened. She tried to interject, but I was prepared. Every objection she raised, I countered with evidence, with law, with logic. The room felt electric, a quiet storm brewing between my determination and their arrogance. But it wasn't just about facts. I could see the psychological game unfolding. The HOA thrived on fear and intimidation. I refused to give them an inch. I stood tall, steady, unwavering. Each glance I threw at them, each pause was a challenge. "Try me. Push me, I dare you." At one point, Karen slammed her gavel lightly on the table, trying to regain control. "We have rules for a reason. You're disrupting the peace of this neighborhood." I leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. "The only thing being disrupted is justice, and I will not allow your rules to strip away my rights or anyone else." I could see the tension rise, hear the collective intake of breath from neighbors and board members alike. It was working. They were on edge, unsure, faltering in a way they never had before. I had turned their own power against them. As the meeting drew to a close, I didn't celebrate. That would be premature. Karen muttered something about reviewing next steps, her voice tight with frustration. I left the hall with my head high, knowing I had planted a seed of doubt in their minds. They hadn't expected a fight, and now they were scrambling to figure out what came next. Outside, I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders finally easing slightly. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA would come back with their next move, and I had to be ready. I had to stay several steps ahead because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about showing that no organization, no matter how meticulously organized, could take away my rights without a fight. As I drove home, the quiet streets of my neighborhood seemed different. The perfect lawns, the painted fences, the calm facades, all of it was just a mask. Behind it, a battle was brewing, and I was ready for every twist, every move, and every moment that lay ahead. Tomorrow, the real game begins, and they won't know what hit them. The morning after the meeting, I felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. Triumph, because I had held my ground and shaken the board's confidence. Dread, because I knew their next move would be ruthless. Karen and her board never took defeat lightly, and I could already feel the gears of their revenge starting to turn. By mid-morning, the first signs appeared. A stack of official-looking notices slipped under my door, each more aggressive than the last. Fines for supposed infractions I hadn't committed, warnings about failing to comply with community standards. And of course, a reiteration of the firearm ban, now framed as an urgent safety directive. My blood boiled as I read each one, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panic would be exactly what they wanted. I realized something critical. They were trying to intimidate me into submission. This wasn't about law anymore, it was psychological warfare. I took a deep breath, reminded myself why I was doing this, and began documenting everything. Each notice, every email, every whispered rumor from neighbors would become part of my arsenal. I also started noticing subtle changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors who once waved politely now gave me cold nods, avoiding eye contact. I overheard snippets of conversations, quiet whispers about my dangerous defiance or how nobody should stand up to the HOA. Some neighbors were afraid, others clearly supported me but were too scared to speak openly. It was the perfect storm: fear, tension, and uncertainty, and I knew I could turn it all to my advantage. I spent the afternoon reaching out to a few trusted neighbors, carefully gauging their willingness to help. Some had long-standing grudges against Karen and the board, silently seething over minor fines and petty rules. Others were simply fed up with the overreach, ready for someone to challenge the status quo. Slowly, I began to build a quiet coalition, allies who could tip the balance without drawing attention. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their campaign. I received letters accusing me of creating a hostile environment and disrupting community harmony. They were clever, framing their intimidation as concern for the neighborhood. I couldn't help but smirk at the irony, threatening fines and lawsuits as a way to maintain harmony. It was absurd, but dangerously effective for anyone less prepared than me. By evening, I had my plan. It had to be methodical, precise, and unassailable. Step 1. Respond to every notice, every accusation, with documented evidence showing the overreach and illegality of their actions. Step 2. Quietly gather testimony from neighbors who had been intimidated or fined unfairly in the past. Step 3. Escalate strategically, making it clear I was ready to take legal action if necessary. But I also had to play the long game. The HOA thrived on quick compliance. They wanted immediate submission, a public acknowledgement of their authority. I couldn't give them that. I had to appear calm, almost casual, while silently tightening the noose around their credibility. Every response I sent, every neighbor I spoke to, every documented violation became another step toward turning the tables. The tension was almost unbearable. Every time I saw Karen at the mailbox or walking her dog, her gaze seemed to bore into me, a challenge and a warning all at once. But I refused to flinch. I knew the moment I showed fear, even a flicker, she would seize it and escalate further. By nightfall, I was exhausted but determined. I reviewed my notes, my evidence, and my strategy. The HOA believed they could crush me with bureaucracy, intimidation, and fear. They thought they could scare me into submission with fines and letters. But I had patience, preparation, and a plan. And in battles like this, patience and preparation were worth more than all their gavel-wielding authority combined. As I locked up my home and gazed out at the quiet street, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about me anymore. It had become a test of principle, a stand against an organization that believed fear was power. And I knew, deep down, that if I played this right, I wouldn't just win for myself. I'd send a message that no one should be bullied into giving up their rights. I whispered to myself, barely audible over the hum of the night, "They've escalated, now it's my turn. And when I strike back, they won't know what hit them." Tomorrow, the HOA would make their next move. But by then, I would already be 3 steps ahead, and the real battle, the one that would shake the entire neighborhood, would begin. The day of the next HOA confrontation arrived, and I could feel the tension before I even stepped out of my car. The community hall looked the same, calm and ordinary, but I knew the storm brewing inside. Every board member was there, each one seated like generals in a war room, Karen at the center, eyes sharp and calculating. They were ready for a fight, but they had no idea I had spent the last week preparing for this moment. As I entered the room, silence fell. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some watching with curiosity, others with apprehension. I could feel their eyes on me, and I understood that more than just my rights were at stake. This was becoming a neighborhood-wide spectacle, a test of courage and principle. Karen stood first, her voice sharp, full of authority. "We've called this emergency meeting to address the continued disregard for our regulations. Your actions, Mr. Johnson, are unacceptable. You are creating unrest." I took a slow breath, letting the weight of the room sink in, then replied calmly, "Unrest? No, what I'm creating is accountability." I let the words hang, letting them echo against the polished walls. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in Karen's eyes, a tiny crack, but a crack nonetheless. I started my presentation, carefully structured, calm but relentless. Each point was backed with evidence, laws, precedents, and documentation of their past overreach. I showed how the firearm ban violated state law and the Constitution, how their enforcement methods were inconsistent and discriminatory, and how intimidation had become their primary tool of governance. The room grew tense. Board members exchanged glances, whispering to each other, suddenly unsure of their footing. Karen's jaw tightened, her gavel tapping nervously on the table. The confidence they had wielded like a weapon only days ago was slipping, and I could feel it. "You see," I continued, "this isn't about comfort or safety, it's about control. And control through fear is not law, it's tyranny. And tyranny has no place in our neighborhood or anywhere in America." Murmurs spread through the room. A few neighbors, emboldened by my words, nodded subtly. I could feel the tide beginning to shift. Every statement I made chipped away at the authority the HOA had assumed as absolute. Karen tried to regain control. "You're manipulating your neighbors, creating a hostile environment." I cut her off, calm but firm. "I'm standing up for my rights, for legal precedent, and for principle. If that makes some uncomfortable, perhaps they need to question why they trusted a board that oversteps its boundaries." The room fell silent. You could feel the tension crackling in the air, heavy and electric. The board had prepared for confrontation, for intimidation, but they hadn't prepared for unshakable resolve backed by law and principle. Then came the moment of truth. I laid out my secret weapon, the evidence of past abuses, the neighbors willing to testify, the documented threats and fines that had been used to intimidate. The documents were clear, undeniable. The board's eyes widened as they realized the scope of what they were facing. Karen's voice faltered for the first time, a slight tremor betraying her usual confidence. This is," she stammered, looking around at her fellow board members for support. There was none. They were cornered, and they knew it. I stood tall, letting the room absorb the weight of the moment. "This isn't personal. It's about law, fairness, and principle. I didn't come here to fight you. I came here to ensure the rules you enforce are just, legal, and reasonable." By the time I left the meeting, the energy in the neighborhood had shifted. Karen and her board were silent, their previous aura of invincibility shattered. Neighbors approached me quietly, some with whispered thanks, others just nodding, emboldened by the courage they had witnessed. But I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA would recover, regroup, and probably try again. What had changed, however, was the balance of power. I had shown them that courage, preparation, and principle could topple their illusion of absolute control. As I walked back to my car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the manicured lawns, I allowed myself a small smile. The first strike had landed. The board's confidence was shaken, and more importantly, the neighborhood had seen that one person standing firm could make a difference. I whispered to myself, heart pounding but steady, "This is only the beginning. They thought they could crush me, but they've awakened something far stronger. The real fight is just starting." The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Word had spread about my stand against the HOA, and I could feel eyes on me everywhere I went. Some neighbors whispered words of support, others still gave me wary glances, unsure whether to join or stay silent. But I didn't have time to worry about whispers. I had a plan, and today was the day to execute it. I arrived early at the community hall, armed with evidence, legal references, and a quiet confidence that had grown over weeks of preparation. The board, as usual, arrived in full force, their expressions a mixture of irritation, arrogance, and unbeknownst to them fear. They thought they were about to finish what they started. They couldn't have been more wrong. Karen was the first to speak. Her voice carried the same sharp authority as before, but I noticed the tremor beneath it. "We're here to enforce the rules and maintain order in this neighborhood. Your continued defiance cannot be tolerated." I leaned forward, calm, deliberate, letting the room feel my presence. "Defiance? No, this is accountability, and I came prepared. I began presenting my evidence, the documented overreach, the letters threatening fines, the inconsistencies in enforcement, and of course, the state and federal laws that protected my rights. Every document I laid out on the table was a small strike, piercing through the veneer of their authority. The room grew silent. I could see the subtle shifting in the board members' eyes, the arrogance fading, replaced with uncertainty. They had never faced someone who was not only prepared but also unwaveringly committed to principle. I continued, step by step, showing that their so-called safety rules were selective, inconsistent, and illegal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every fact, every document, every reference was louder than any shouting could ever be. Karen's face went pale. Her gavel hovered in her hand, useless now. She tried to interrupt, but I had anticipated it. Please, I said, calm but firm, let's ensure the discussion is based on law and fairness, not fear and intimidation. At that moment, a few neighbors, emboldened by what they were witnessing, quietly voiced their support. We agree, one said. The rules have been enforced unfairly. Others nodded, some offering evidence of minor fines they had received for ridiculous infractions. I didn't need many. They just needed a spark to ignite the truth that the board could no longer suppress. Karen's voice cracked as she attempted to regain control. This isn't how we handle things. I cut in, steady, unflinching. No, Karen, this is how justice works. Your board assumed power without accountability. Today that ends. Every eye in the room was on her now. I could feel the shift. The power dynamic had completely flipped. The HOA, the entity that had once dictated every aspect of our neighborhood's life, was exposed, vulnerable, and scrambling. Their authority had always relied on fear and submission. Once that fear vanished, so did their control. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to concede. The firearm ban would be lifted. The fines that had been threatened were voided. The rules had to align with the law, not the whims of the board. Victory didn't feel abstract. It was tangible. I had not only defended my own rights, but had also reminded every resident that courage, preparation, and principle mattered more than intimidation. Walking out of the hall, the sun low in the sky, I felt a mix of relief and exhilaration. The board members avoided eye contact, murmuring among themselves. Karen's confident posture was gone, replaced by tight-lipped frustration. They had underestimated me, and that mistake would be remembered. Neighbors approached quietly, some with handshakes, others with smiles of silent respect. I realized that my stand had sparked something bigger than just my own fight. It had reminded people that rights and principles aren't granted by committees, they're inherent, defended by those willing to stand firm. As I walked back to my home, I reflected on the journey, the fear, the preparation, the tension, the first confrontation, and finally this moment. It had been exhausting, stressful, and emotionally draining, but it had been worth every second. I whispered under my breath, a grin forming despite the lingering tension. They tried to take my rights. They tried to intimidate me, but the Second Amendment doesn't bow to HOA rules, and neither do I. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift. Not just my own burden, but the burden that had been silently pressing on my neighborhood, the reminder that principle, courage, and law still mattered. And though the HOA would recover, regroup, and probably try to test limits again, one thing was certain: they had learned a lesson. One person, prepared and unyielding, could stand up to bureaucracy and emerge victorious. And today, that person was me. The neighborhood felt different the morning after the final confrontation. The quiet streets, the perfectly trimmed lawns, the same white picket fences, they looked the same, but everything had changed. I could feel it in the air, a subtle shift, like the calm after a storm. The board no longer held the invisible leash of fear over the residents. They had learned, finally, that intimidation and overreach only work until someone refuses to bow. Walking to my mailbox, I noticed neighbors' expressions. Some smiled subtly, as if acknowledging an unspoken truth. Courage could win. Others still avoided eye contact, hesitant to openly show support but quietly relieved that someone had stood up. And then there were a few, those who had been quietly watching from the shadows, who now seemed emboldened. I realized the ripple I had created was far larger than just my fight. Sitting on my porch later that day, I reflected on the journey. It had begun with a simple, terrifying letter banning firearms from my property. What had felt like a personal attack had evolved into a battle of principle, a stand against bureaucracy, and a reminder that rights are not negotiable. Every sleepless night, every meticulous plan, every whispered conversation with neighbors had led to this moment of quiet triumph. But it wasn't just about me. This fight had reminded the entire neighborhood that the HOA wasn't the final authority. The rules of law, fairness, and justice mattered more. People had been silenced for too long, intimidated by letters, fines, and vague threats. Today, that fear had been dismantled. My victory wasn't just personal, it was collective. It was a reminder that even one voice, when backed by courage and preparation, could challenge the illusion of absolute power. As the day wore on, I noticed Karen and the board walking through the neighborhood. They were subdued, polite in public, but their confidence was gone. They had faced the consequences of underestimating someone who refused to comply blindly. I couldn't help but feel a small, quiet satisfaction at the thought. They had built an empire on fear, and I had exposed its fragility. I also thought about the cost. This battle had been emotionally exhausting, a roller coaster of tension, frustration, and anticipation. I had questioned myself, my strategy, and whether I could endure the pressure. But through every challenge, I had held fast. And now, as I looked around my neighborhood, I realized the stakes had been worth it. The fight had strengthened me, sharpened my resolve, and reminded me of why standing up matters, even when the odds seem stacked against you. That evening, I walked past the community hall one last time. The gavel, the papers, the aura of control, it all seemed smaller now. Power built on fear was fragile, and those who wielded it had learned that lesson the hard way. My victory wasn't just in lifting the firearm ban, it was in proving that principle, preparation, and courage could topple even the most organized authority. Sitting back on my porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, I allowed myself to smile. I thought about the weeks of preparation, the sleepless nights, the tension-filled confrontations. Every moment had led to this quiet triumph, and it felt surreal. Freedom, fairness, and justice were not just words, they were lived, fought for, and defended. And I knew one thing for certain. The HOA would never underestimate another resident again. Today, the lesson had been taught. Today, courage had triumphed over intimidation. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, I whispered quietly, almost to myself, but with unshakable conviction. They tried to take my rights. They tried to intimidate me, but I stood firm. And today, justice rose in my backyard, louder than any letter, louder than any gavel, louder than any threat. This is my home. This is my neighborhood. And no one, no HOA, will ever take that from me again. As I looked around the quiet streets, I felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had been won, but the real victory was something far more enduring. The reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, can inspire courage in others, shift power, and protect freedom, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. The sun set, casting long shadows across the lawns, and I knew the neighborhood, and I would never be the same. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.